Okay, what I'm going to speak about today, brothers and sisters, is marriage. And if anyone says, well, I'm not married, I'm single, or I'm widowed, or divorced, or whatever, this message is also for you. And you'll see why in a little bit. But what I'm not going to delve into today, and it's necessary to mention this, is divorce or divorce and remarriage. And the reason is, last Tuesday, Rabbi and I discussed the message, and he felt, and I agreed with him, he felt that that subject deserves an entire teaching by itself. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people in Messianic and other circles who very badly misunderstand the divorce and remarriage situation, and they cause a lot of grief in the lives of people. And so he told me that he's going to treat that separately. So anyhow, we're going to proceed. The first reference to marriage of a type is found in Bereshith, chapter 2, and verse 18, where we read that Yahweh Elohim said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I am going to make a helper for him as his counterpart." I think the term there is Ezer Negev, his counterpart. And if we go down to verse 24, the very significant verse, after Yahweh creates Hawa, or Eve as she's called in some translations, he says, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And in the Hebrew, it says they shall be unified. And that's something very significant for us to keep in mind. They shall be unified. Now, I think it's necessary to mention something else here. When Yahweh created Adam and Hawa, and she's called Eve, he created one man and one woman. And he didn't create two men or two women. That's strictly forbidden. If we turn to Leviticus, I'm just going to mention this very briefly. If we turn to Leviticus or Vayikra, chapter 18 and verse 22, we read, "Do not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." And if we go over to chapter 20, verse 13, we read, "A man who lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have done abomination. They shall certainly be put to death. Their blood is upon them." And we also find similar injunctions in the book of Romans. And I know it's before the Supreme Court. I didn't hear what the outcome was, but whether same-sex marriage is legitimate or not. In my opinion, that should never even be an issue, because if our courts were based on the Bible and on the Torah, we wouldn't be discussing it. But that's all I'm going to say about it. But we have to keep in mind that marriage is an honorable state. If we turn over to the book of Hebrews and verse 13, Hebrews verse 13, or chapter 13, I'm sorry. Chapter 13, and we're going to read verse 4. Hebrews 13:4. Give me a minute to turn there, please, or a few seconds anyhow. 13:4. "Let marriage be respected by all, and the bed be undefiled, but Elohim shall judge those who whore and adulterers. So marriage is an honorable state. And we know that Yeshua himself attended one of the marriage feasts in Cana of Galilee, and we can read about that in Yochanan or John chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, and that is where, at his mother's insistence, he performed his first miracle, turning water into wine. And he said, "Woman, my time has not yet come," but she just said to the servants, "Do as he tells you." So Yeshua had respect for his mother. And this was at a marriage ceremony. Now, I'd like to, for us to read about, and we're going to take a little time with this, what in my opinion is the ideal marriage in the Bible. We have all kind of weird ideas sometimes about marriage today. But the ideal marriage is found in Bereshith, or Genesis chapter 24. And we're going to start reading in verse 2. And Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had, "Please put your hand under my thigh." That was the way of swearing an oath or a vow, taking a vow. "So that I make you swear by Yahweh, the Elohim of the heavens and the Elohim of the earth, that you do not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell." Now I believe, and there's ample scripture for this, I believe that the Torah existed before Sinai. And we're not going to go into that, but if you want to discuss it later, we can discuss it. And I believe that Avinu Avraham knew what we're going to read in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3. We have a command. It's a positive mitzvah, or one of the negative mitzvahs. That's thou shalt not. "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughter to his son, and do not take his daughter for your son. For he turns your son away from following me to serve other mighty ones. Then the displeasure of Yahweh shall burn against you and promptly destroy you." So Avinu Avraham, our father Abraham, knew that if he allowed his son Yitzhak to marry one of the Haaretz, one of the daughters of the people of the land, that there was a very good chance that they would turn away Yitzhak's heart from following Yahweh. And he didn't want that to happen. He was taking every step to see that it didn't happen. And so he instructed his servant in verse 4, "Go to my land and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Yitzhak." And the servant said to him, "Well, what if the woman refuses to follow me to this land? Do I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" And Abraham said, "Beware, lest you take my son back there. I don't want him going there. I want him to stay here. This is the promised land. This is where he belongs. Yahweh Elohim of the heavens, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my relatives, and who spoke to me and swore, saying, 'To your seed I give this land.' He sends his messenger before you." In other words, you're going on a journey at my behest. And I know that Yahweh is going to send his angels before you. He's going to work everything out. Abraham had that faith. "And you shall take a wife for my son from there. And if the woman refuses to follow you, then you shall be released from this oath. Only do not take my son back there." So then the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. So now the servant begins a journey. And he took camels. and 10 of his master's camels. And they were loaded with provisions for the trip, but they were also loaded with jewels and precious stones to give as a gift or a dowry for the woman that he had hoped to get. And the servant didn't go by himself. He went with an entourage of men because travel was very dangerous in those days. And so he had some other men with him who were no doubt armed and able to defend themselves against the hazards they might meet along the way, but thankfully they didn't meet any. And so finally now the servant comes to Abraham's native land. And he left, it says, for all his master's good gifts were in his hand. He was very trusted. This servant is not named. He's just referred to as the servant. And he went to Aram Naharaim, to the city of Nahor. And he made his camels kneel down outside the city by a fountain of water at evening time, the time when women go out to draw water. That was one of the duties that the women had, was to draw water, drinking water and water for the livestock and then the cattle or whatever. And it's very significant that wives were always met at a well. This was true of Yitzhak. Of course, he didn't personally meet her at the well, but she was first met by the servant at the well. And this was also true for Yaakov's wife. And other cases we read where the wives that were chosen by the patriarchs or women who were chosen to receive a very special message were always met at a well. Why is that? Well, it's something for you to reflect on. We can turn to Devarim or Deuteronomy. Just hold your finger where you're at. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 2, let my instruction fall as rain, my speech drop as dew, as fine rain on the tender plants, and as showers on the grass. See, water is representative of doctrine. And so the common meeting place, the thing that people have in common when they get, should be the doctrine, should be Torah. That's a hint, it's a remez telling us this is your common bond. Torah. And that's why that's mentioned in there. So now we have the servant preparing to meet this woman that he's never seen. He doesn't know who she is. And first thing he does is pray. In verse 12, and he said, Yahweh, Elohim of my master Abraham, please cause her, whoever her is, to meet before me this day and show loving commitment to my master Abraham. Now you see, the servant always had in mind that he was doing the will of his master. He never said, let her meet me and here I am, but he kept in mind and always put forth the idea that he was there representing his master, Abraham. And he says, see, I'm standing here by the fountain of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now let it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your jar to let me drink, and she says, drink, and let me water your camels too, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Yitzhak. And let me know by this that you have shown loving commitment to my master. So what he was saying here is, I'm going to ask her for a drink of water for me and my man. But if she goes one step further and says, yeah, I'll draw water for you men to drink, but I'll also water your camels for you because you've come on a long journey. And it came to be that before he had ended speaking, this is the way Yahweh works sometime. Before he ended speaking, see, Rivkah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her jar on her shoulder, and the young woman was very good looking. She was a knockout. She was beautiful. And she was a maiden, no man having known her. She kept herself chaste and pure. And she went down to the fountain, filled her jar, and came up. And the servant ran to meet her. And he said, "Oh, please give me a drink, a little water from your jar." And she says, no hesitation here. She says, "Drink, my master." And she hurried and let her jar down to her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she says, "Oh, let me draw water for your camels too, until they have finished drinking." So she went above and beyond what she was asked. And she hurried and emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the fountain, and drew water for all of his camels. All right, now, if we go down to verse 23, he said, "Whose daughter are you? Please inform me. And is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" And she said, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, Milcah's son, whom she bore to Nahor." And she said to him, "We have both straw and fodder enough and room to spend the night." And the man bowed down his head and worshiped Yahweh. Here's at least the second time that he bows down and gives Yahweh thanks for completing his mission. And he said, "Blessed be Yahweh, Elohim of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving commitment and his truth toward my master. As for me, being on the way, Yahweh has led me to the house of my master's brothers." That's what Abraham told him. Go to my land, go to my people. He'd never been there before. He didn't know anything about the land. He didn't know who the people were. He trusted in Almighty Yahweh to lead him. And then the young woman ran and informed those of her mother's house these matters. And Rivkah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran out to the man to the fountain. And it came to be, I guess we skipped this verse, when he saw the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists, he gave her a nose ring that weighed half a shekel of gold and bracelets that weighed 10 shekels of gold. That caught his eye. We can tell where his mind is. He heard the words of his sister Rivkah saying, "This man spoke thus to me," that he went to the man and saw him standing by the camels at the fountain. And he said, "Come in, O blessed of Yahweh. Why do you stand outside? I myself have prepared the house and a place for the camels." And then, of course, the servant goes in and he reiterates everything that happened to Laban and to the rest of the family, and how he put this prayer or this fleece before Almighty Yahweh, that a young woman would come out and when asked would offer him a drink and would volunteer to also water his camels. Now, if we go down to verse 49, "And now if you are going to show loving commitment and truth to my master, let me know. If not, let me know, so that I turn to the right or to the left." And Laban answered, "Bethuel too." And he said, "The matter comes from Yahweh, and we are not able to speak to you either evil or good. This is up to Yahweh," he said. "See, Rivkah is before you. Take her and go. Let her be your master's son's wife, as Yahweh has spoken." So they're willing to agree, but there's another consideration that's going to come up here. "And it came to be, when Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself toward the earth before Yahweh." Here he gives Yahweh thanks again. "And the servant brought out ornaments of silver and ornaments of gold and garments and gave them to Rivkah. And he also gave costly gifts to her brother and to her mother. And he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night. And when they arose in the morning, he said, "Let me go to my master." But her brother and her mother said, "Oh, let the young woman stay with us a few days, at least 10, then go." And he said to them, "Do not delay me, since Yahweh has prospered my way. Let me go, so I go to my master." And they said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." So what we have to keep in mind that this was an arranged marriage, but it was not a forced marriage. There was no coercion. The final decision was up to Rivkah or Rebekah. She could have said, "No, I don't think I want to go. I don't know this guy. I don't know where he's going to take me or anything." But she had faith. And her answer was very simple. So they called Rivkah and said to her, "Are you going with this man?" And she said, "Yeah, I shall go. I'm going." And so they let go Rivkah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rivkah and said to her, "Let our sister become the mother of thousands of 10,000s, and let your seed possess the gates of those who hate them." And Rivkah and her young women arose, and they rode on the camels and followed the man. So the servant took Rivkah and left. Now, they're coming back to the land of Canaan, where Abraham and his son Yitzhak dwelt and made their home. And she's about to meet Yitzhak. And Yitzhak came from the way of Beer Lahairoi, for he dwelt in the south. And Yitzhak went out to meditate in the field in the evening. What does meditate mean? It doesn't mean sitting cross-legged with your hands on your knees and going om, om, staring at a candle. It simply means to think on the things of Torah. When we read the scriptures, we can shut our Bibles and sit there for a while and close our eyes and think about what we've read and think how this applies to us, or think about how we can apply the things that we've learned to our daily lives. That's meditation. So he went out to meditate. He's walking in the field thinking on the things of Yahweh. And Yitzhak lifted his eyes and looked and saw the camels coming. And Rivkah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Yitzhak, dismounted from her camel. Why is that in there? It's noted that she dismounted from her camel. I'll give you my opinion. Because when she first met this man, she did not want to look down on him. She was probably a little shorter than he was. She wanted to look up at him. She didn't want to ride up on her camel or on a horse or any other animal and have to look down on the man who was going to be her husband. And she said to her servant, "Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?" Of course, she knew who he was. And the servant said, "It is my master." So she took a veil and covered herself. Why would she cover herself with a veil? Well, again, my opinion, I think that she covered herself with a veil because, as we read previously, the scripture says she was a very good-looking woman. And she did not want Yitzhak to be impressed at first by her physical beauty, but she wanted to impress him by the words that she spoke. He would undoubtedly have some questions, and she wanted him to be impressed by how she answered those questions. And she undoubtedly had questions for him. We have to read between the lines here a little bit. So she wanted him to be impressed by the questions that she asked him. You can tell a lot about people by the questions that they ask and the way they ask them. And I think that's the situation we have here. So she took a veil and she covered herself. And she also wanted to convey to him her modesty. And so the servant told Yitzhak all the matters that he had done. And then it simply says, Yitzhak brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rivkah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Thus Yitzhak was comforted after his mother's death. Let's think about that. That was their marriage ceremony. And strangely enough, there was no priest, no rabbi, no prophet. Even Avinu Avraham wasn't there. There was no ketubah written out that he presented to her. But there was one thing that I'm certain was present in that marriage. And the one thing that often we lack today, not just in the marriage covenant, but in a lot of other relationships, like maybe our relationship with our congregation or our marriage, and that thing is commitment. Our word is our bond. Yitzhak was fully committed to having Rivkah as his wife, and she was fully committed to being her husband, no matter what they encountered, no matter what it took. And we have to consider that Rivkah was such a perfect wife throughout many years to Yitzhak, and evidently he was a perfect husband to her, that he wanted no other wife. A lot of the patriarchs had 2 wives or 3, or they had a wife and a concubine. Not Yitzhak. He had one woman in his life, the love of his life, Rivkah, Rebekah. And for them, there was no one else. Something for us to think about. Okay, I said there was no ketubah. We have to say something about a ketubah marriage today. I know Rabbi Steve said he performed some ketubah marriages, or he knows of people who had a ketubah marriage. This is a marriage that's not sanctioned by the government, but it is a commitment agreed to by 2 people. I performed 2 of them. One couple is still married today. The other couple, the husband died of a massive heart attack some years after they were married. A ketubah marriage, I believe, is valid in the sight of Yahweh, because I don't believe that man has the right to say who is married and who isn't. It's valid, but there are some pitfalls. And one of them is, in a lot of states, there's no real legal standing. About, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, the state of Pennsylvania decided that what's called common law marriage would no longer be recognized. At one time, I think in Pennsylvania, if a man and woman lived together for, I think it was 20 years, they were considered married. In the state of Texas, if you go to a function or an event with a woman and you introduce her as your wife, she's your wife, okay? And so I know Dale's lived in Texas, and maybe he can affirm that's true. And I've heard that from other people. So different state. Yeah, you are. You have a legal commitment then. Now, of course, you shouldn't be going to a motel with someone who's not your wife, but people do that today. Okay, so a ketubah marriage, what a ketubah is, it's a legal agreement. And today, it's just a moral agreement. And it provides for, if the husband and wife get divorced, that he will continue to support her financially. So if you have a ketubah marriage and you divorce your wife, man, you're not off the hook. Now, by the way, there are 2 stages to a Hebrew or a Jewish marriage. The first stage is called kiddushin. which is betrothal. In other words, you're engaged. And in that first stage, legally, the woman is your wife. And the woman is set apart. An incident happened when Joanne and I were engaged. I was in Pennsylvania, and she was up in Wisconsin, although we were engaged. And she went to a regional meeting for Shabbat. And this guy come up, and he started getting friendly with her. And Joanne was trying to avoid him, and her mother intervened and said, "She's engaged." And he said, "Well, I don't see any ring on her finger, so she's fair game." And if I was there, I'd have probably punched the guy, you know. But she was not fair game because she was betrothed, and evidently he didn't understand betrothal. You know. So when a woman is betrothed, she's set apart. All right. The next stage is, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is nisuin. This is a full-fledged marriage. And nisuin comes from a Hebrew word meaning elevation. So when you get married, you become elevated. You go a step up the ladder spiritually. So marriage is a spiritual elevation. Now, this brings us to another question. Who should we marry? Well, again, we have to go back to Devarim, or Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 and 4. We don't marry anyone outside the faith. And I mentioned this once before, and it caused some questions. The Bible does not prohibit interracial or interethnic marriages. It prohibits interfaith marriages. If two people of a different race want to get married, as long as they're in the faith, that's fine. My grandmother had a list of different ethnicities that were okay for me to marry and some were not okay for me to marry. Don't marry this person because their ethnicity does this or that. And they wouldn't make a good wife. Now, what makes a good wife is, we'll get into that. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we'll be coming back here quite a bit. 1 Corinthians and we'll go to chapter 7. And we'll read verse 39. A wife is bound by Torah as long as her husband lives. And if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she desires, only in the master. Only in the master. And we can also read 2 Corinthians 6:14. If we turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. Do not become unevenly yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness and lawlessness? And what fellowship has light with darkness? And we also can note Amos chapter 3, verse 3, can two walk together except they be agreed? Now, we've all known of interfaith marriages. Some work out and some don't. We'll elaborate on that in a minute, or a few minutes. I knew a gentleman. He was in the faith. He was a friend of mine. He came into the faith and his wife didn't. Of course, they were content to dwell together. But they had some problems. In the springtime, he would put away as much leaven out of the house as he could. Of course, his wife would bring some in. And he would eat matzos. And around the same time, she would invite some of her family over for an Easter dinner, which ham would be on the menu. That caused problems. In the fall, she wanted the kids to go Halloweening. He didn't. That caused problems. But in December, you know what? She'd be putting up a tree in the window, a big one. And after he came into the faith, she put up the biggest tree she could find. And he'd put up a Hanukkah. He didn't really understand or keep Hanukkah, but he put it up sort of, I guess, as a protest to his wife's practicing Christmas. But this was very difficult on the children that they had, because the wife wanted the children to keep Christmas and go Halloweening and celebrate Easter, and he wanted them to keep Yahweh's holy days and was trying to teach them the Torah, so the children were confused. In our own family, one of my daughters came back to the faith after she had married a man who was essentially an unbeliever, and he did not approve of her coming back at all. And they had problems, big problems. And again, it was hard on the children. But I'll tell you how this can spread. She wanted to come to Shabbat services, and she wanted to keep the Torah, and the children went with her, and he became adamantly opposed to this. But then it involved the in-laws, his parents. And his parents were very upset with one of my daughters, by the way, because she was in this weird religion that went to church on Saturday and didn't keep Christmas. And they were very upset with her. And they turned against her, and they tried to turn the children. And ultimately, everything came back to me, because I was the one who coerced my daughter, and I didn't, by the way. I just prayed for her. That's probably the worst thing you could do. I prayed for my daughter that she would come back to the faith. And I never said anything to her. One day I got a phone call from her asking if she could attend the service. I said, well, sure you could. So because of that, he who was my son-in-law at the time hated me, and his parents hated me. So these are some of the complications that we run into if we're involved in any way in an interfaith marriage. And again, I want to stress that that is interfaith marriage. It has nothing to do with race or ethnic origin, although some people would like to twist it that it is. Now, what if you're not married to a believer? Again, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 has some very specific instructions about that. And we'll start reading in chapter 7, verse 12. It says, to the rest I say, not the master. This is Rav Shaul, or Paul speaking. If any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she thinks well to live with him, let him not send her away. If you're married to an unbelieving wife and you're getting along, don't rock the boat. And if a woman has an unbelieving husband and he thinks well to live with her, let her not send him away. Don't rock the boat. Now, sometimes problems develop and the boat gets rocked. But we're not talking about that kind of situation. For the unbelieving husband has been set apart by the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been set apart by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are set apart. So sometimes if you find yourself in that type of situation where one of the people in a marriage partnership becomes a believer and the other one doesn't, okay, it can be worked out. It's not necessarily in itself a cause for separation. For how do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you shall save your wife? There's always hope. And how can we convince our marriage partner to come into Torah? Not by browbeating them or picking at them constantly, but by the example of the life we lead. If we lead a righteous life, then they're going to see our example, and maybe, just maybe, that'll impress them, and they'll say, well, okay, maybe I'll go to services with you once or twice and see what this is all about. Now, let's read verse 17. Only as Elohim has distributed to each one, as the master has called each one, so let him walk. And walk is, what is walk in Hebrew? Halakha, a way to walk, a way we apply the Torah to our lives and demonstrate it to others. And so I order in all the assemblies. All right, now, what if a situation crops up where you have a problem in your marriage and there doesn't seem to be any precedent for it? Let's read verse 25, because that happened here in 1 Corinthians. And concerning maidens, I have no command from the master. In other words, Rav Shaul was saying, we have a situation, we have a problem here for which there's no biblical precedent. I don't really know what to do, but I give judgment. I give my judgment as one whom the master in his compassion has made trustworthy. So brothers and sisters, if you're having a problem in your marriage and there doesn't seem to be a very clear-cut, definite scriptural solution to that problem, then you have to trust and rely on leadership. Go to the leaders and trust that Almighty Yahweh will give them the wisdom to solve your problem, to give them wisdom to make a judgment. And again, sometimes judgments are made when there's no scriptural precedent. We don't really know what to do according to Scripture, so we have to make some kind of a judgment. And if one leader cannot make the judgment, say if Rabbi Steve cannot make a judgment, he'll call the other leaders and say, hey guys, look, we've got to get our heads together and find a solution to this problem. And I believe that a solution that's in harmony with Yahweh's will be found. Now, the Talmud says, and this is interesting, if a man marries an evil woman, he becomes evil. That's Talmud. But if a man marries a righteous woman, he becomes righteous. So that's all the more reason to marry a believing person, a righteous person. Now, brothers and sisters, marriage isn't simply a union between two people in love. The goal of each individual is to draw close, that's have a close union with Almighty Yahweh. And the purpose of marriage is that each person in that marriage can help the other fulfill that goal. There's something to keep in mind. When I married Joanne, my goal was to help her develop a better relationship with Yahweh. And her goal was to help me develop a better relationship with Yahweh. She had a lot of work cut out for her. But I want to say something about love. People say, I'm in love. When we were engaged, Joanne was still in Wisconsin. I was in Pennsylvania. Her mother asked her just out of the blue one day, "Why do you want to marry Tom?" And Joanne says, "I love him." And her mother says, "No, you don't." She said, "Yes, I do. I love him." "No, you don't." "What do you mean I don't?" "You don't know him. Only when you've been married for 5 or 10 years and you can look back and say, I still want to be married to this man, then you know that you love him. And if he still wants to be married to you, then you know that he loves you. That's love. But people today have some wacky definitions of love. And the soulmate thing comes into play. I believe in soulmates. I believe in, what's it called, Beshertha. I believe that Joanne is my Beshertha. I know some of you believe that your wives are your Beshertha, your soulmate. But we had a case here several years ago where a young woman, by the way, she was a Jewish woman, had an affair with one of our presidents. And she said, "He's my soulmate." And this woman had no idea what a soulmate was. She should have, but she didn't. And her affair became a national scandal, an international scandal. And he almost got impeached because of it. What is a soulmate? The rabbis teach that each one of us are a half, and somewhere we have another half. So you're joining two halves to make a whole. And we can think of it as a divine dance. If I get up here and start dancing by myself, I'd look kind of foolish. But if I take my wife by the hand and say, "May I have this dance?" and we dance together, I'd still probably look pretty foolish by the way I dance, but at least I'd have a partner, right? I'd try not to tramp on her feet too much. It's a divine dance. So we also have the phrase, the other half, or the better half. And do we mean that? Because that's what our wives or our husbands are, our other half. And we have to also recognize each person's rights and obligations. Now we'll go back to marriage between believers. Ephesians chapter 5. If you turn there with me, please. Ephesians chapter 5. I'd like to start reading in verse 21. Subjecting yourselves to each other in the fear of Elohim. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the master, because the husband is the head of the wife, as also the Messiah is the head of the assembly, and he is the Savior of the body. But as the assembly is subject to the Messiah, so also let the wives be to their own husbands in every respect. Husbands, love your wives as the Messiah did love the assembly and gave himself for it, in order to set it apart and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word. There we have water again. In order to present it to himself a splendid assembly, not having spot or wrinkle of any sort, but that it might be set apart and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. Sometimes, us men can become a little narcissistic. We can think, "Oh, look at me, I'm a handsome guy. Any woman would love me," so on. And let's face it, there are times when we love ourselves, but we ought to love our wives just as much, if not more, than we love ourselves. Okay. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but feeds it and cherishes it, as also the master does the assembly, because we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause, and this is again a repeat of what we read in Genesis, or Bereshith, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now there it has the word two. I think in the original Hebrew it doesn't have the word two, but there were only two. So the word two here is correct. The two shall become one flesh. And that's not 3 or 4 or 5 shall become one flesh. 2, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Now, it's necessary to say something about subjection. Wives, be in subjection to your husband. What does that mean, be in subjection to your husband? Well, Joanne and I were in an organization once before that carried subjection to the extreme. It interpreted subjection to the extreme. And I can tell you some real horror stories about this. We knew a couple. One time, the woman looked at her husband and says, we need a new roll of toilet tissue in the bathroom. Is it all right if I replace the roll? I'm serious. And he thought, and he said, well, okay, but be back here in 5 minutes. And she's okay, so she scurries off to put a new roll of toilet paper in, and she gets back. That's not subjection, that's slavery, that's idiocy. But there are men who think that to treat their wives in such a manner is putting them in subjection or under subjection. Kind of an amusing story. There was a couple, and the guy wasn't really in touch with the times too well. The wife says, I need some grocery money. So he said, okay, here's $50. They were having some financial trouble, so he said, I'm going to take control of finances. She said, okay, fine. You might do a better job than I did. So he gives her $50 for groceries. And he says, here, don't complain. She says, okay, I won't. And she went grocery shopping, and she bought everything she could buy for $50. She was very diligent about what she bought. And along about Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week, he came home, and she had supper prepared for him, and it was a really good supper. And he commented on it. He says, man, he said, that was a good supper. She said, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, because you just ate the last of your $50 worth. So he had to give her another $50 to get them through the end of the week. But, you know, we can carry subjection to extremes. Now, subjection, if we look it up in the Strong's Concordance, it means subduing someone or putting them under authority. But if we go a little bit further, sometime the Strong's Concordance will give additional numbers to look up. What subjection is simply recognizing authority. Wives, when you're in subjection to a husband, you have to recognize his authority. And also, Strong says that it is a partnership. So when you're in subjection to your husband, you're in a partnership with him. But Strong's also says it's extending to a goal. Now, when I read that, I thought of a football team. The quarterback gets the ball. The ball's always hiked to the quarterback in a football game, right? And then the quarterback has a decision to make. Do I pass this ball on to someone who looks like he can gain some yardage or maybe make a touchdown? Or do I try to run the ball to the goal myself? He has to make that decision. Nobody else can make it. no one can make it for him. That's the role of a husband. Do I pass the ball on to someone who can get the job done, or do I do it myself? But if I do it myself, I have to have someone run interference. I have to have someone who can get these big guys who are trying to mangle me and take me down out of the way. That's what a marriage is like. That's what subjection is like. So let's not be intimidated by that word subjection. Let's turn to Colossians. Colossians 3, and we're going to read verses 18 through 23. Let no one deprive you of the prize, one who takes delight in false humility and worship of messengers, taking his stand on what he has not seen, puffed up by his fleshly mind. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading in verse 2, or chapter 2. Should be reading in chapter 3. I hate when that happens. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands, as is proper in the master. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter towards them. Children, obey your parents in all, for this is well-pleasing to the master. And fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. This is all part of a marriage and being part of a family. Love your wives. Do not be bitter toward them. If she burns the toast or she burns something, don't be bitter. Accidents happen. And sometimes I take over the cooking duty simply because I like to cook. But if I burn something, Joanne doesn't get mad at me. She says, oops, you burned it. And of course, Joanne, I have to say, Joanne never burnt the toast. One time when the toaster malfunctioned. The toaster burned the toast. Okay. But we don't get bitter toward one another. Accidents happen. And children, obey your parents. We have a blessing of the children up here every Shabbat service. And remember, it takes two to raise the children. So this is another reason for not getting into a mixed marriage, because we don't want to send our children mixed messages. Let's go to 1 Timothy. First Timothy chapter 2. I'll read the right chapter this time. First Timothy chapter 2, starting in verse 8. So I resolve that the men pray everywhere, lifting up hands that are set apart without wrath and disputing. Likewise, that the women dress themselves becomingly with decency and sensibleness, not with braided hair or gold pearls or costly ornaments, but with good works, which is becoming for women undertaking the worship of Elohim. So first of all, it lays some obligations. We said that each partner in a marriage has rights and obligations. And the first obligation of men, if a problem is encountered in your marriage, is to pray. Pray about it. Before you go running up to your wife and making all kind of accusations or getting angry, pray about it. If you have something you'd like your wife to change in, pray about it. Lifting up hands. It doesn't necessarily mean that you lift up your hands, but our hands are the things that we do. They're a metaphor for our actions. So we have to evaluate our own actions and pray. Pray for a solution. And without wrath and disputing. Let a woman learn in silence in all subjection. Well, we've discussed subjection. But I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, rather to be in silence. Because Adam was formed first, then Hawa. Now, that doesn't mean that a woman just has to sit there like a little mouse and be real quiet. You'll never see a woman in this congregation get up here and give a sermon. I don't think you will. I hope you won't. But women do have an obligation, like Miriam led to singing and dancing. They do have an obligation, and they take it very well, to teach the children. And the older women have the obligation to teach the younger women. That's a woman's role. The women have a role in our worship. And it's mostly women that are getting up here and dancing. And it's women who are playing the keyboard and singing. That's their role. But to get up and give a sermon, no. So I think that's very clear cut, but sometimes people like to twist these scriptures. It says, because Adam was formed first, then Hawa. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, having been deceived, fell into transgression. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Rabbi Steve brought out something very interesting. When Adam and Hawa were in the garden, we know that the serpent, however you want to interpret that word serpent, the adversary, whatever, tried to convince Hawa, and he did convince Hawa, to eat the forbidden fruit. What's the forbidden fruit? The Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, to know the difference between good and evil, to take you away from the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination. And she fell for it. And he said just before that point, where Adam should have stepped up and said, wait a minute, quit talking to my wife. And Hawa, quit talking to this person. Get away from them. Don't listen. But he didn't do it. He didn't step in. So who really failed in their obligation? We got to blame the man. Sorry about that. We got to blame the man. So if you see your wife is in danger, if someone's whispering in her ear, step in and say, hey, stop. And women, listen to your husband. Oh, my husband is protecting me. That's the job of the husband, to protect the wife. And sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes I guess the wife has to protect the husband when he gets foolish ideas in his head. So we could say, justifiably so, that Adam failed in his obligation. Now, what if you're single? What if you're divorced, you're widowed, you've never been married, you're getting divorced, whatever? Well, there are certain instructions in here. We know that Shaul was single and the prophet Jeremiah was single. Let's go back again to 1 Corinthians and chapter 7. And verse 7 says, I wish that all men were even as I myself, in other words, single. But each one has his own gift from Elohim, one in this way and another in that way. And verse 8, and I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am, single. And I put the word single in there. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So there's nothing wrong with being single. But, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Every single one of us here, every single one of us hearing this on the live stream or whatever, are someday going to be the guest of honor at a wedding, and it's going to be our wedding. And I think you know where I'm going with that, but we'll get there. I think it's necessary at this time to address an issue that's creeping into the Messianic movement and maybe some other places. Polygamy, plural marriage. We go back to the first reference. Who was the first polygamist? Well, if we turn to Bereshith, Genesis chapter 4, and we're going to read verse 19. Bereshith 4:19. And Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the second was Shelah. And Ada bore Yabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents with livestock. And his brother's name was Ubal, or Jubal. We get the word Jubilee from it. And he was the father of all those who play the lute, the lyre and the flute. And as for Shelah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, a smith of all kinds, of tools in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Shelah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my words. For I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. For if Cain is avenged 7-fold, and Lamech 77-fold. So Cain killed me, the first polygamist. I can't say he was a murderer. Maybe he was guilty of manslaughter. So that's not a good start. But what we have to understand about polygamy is they did it then. And then is not now. Now in the United States of America, polygamy or plural marriage is against the law. And we're told that we must obey the laws of the land. However, there is no Torah against polygamy. It's not a Torah violation. But it results in dysfunctional families. We have the example again of Avinu Avraham. Sarah convinced him to get with Hagar and have Hagar as a surrogate mother, because Yahweh had promised Avraham an heir. And when it didn't happen right now, immediately, Sarah got all upset and bent out of shape. Oh, Yahweh promised it didn't happen, so we got to take matters into our own hands. She didn't wait on Yahweh. And of course, they had Ishmael. And the problem with that is that we still have Ishmael with us today. And he's riding around in pickup trucks waving black flags and cutting people's heads off and burning them to death and literally crucifying them. And he's running around flying planes into buildings and bombing places and threatening to bomb places. That's the legacy of Ishmael. But there's something very interesting. If we turn to Bereshith, Genesis chapter 22, we know that Avraham was commanded, once he had his son Yitzhak born, he was commanded to sacrifice him. That's called the Akedah, or the offering up of Isaac. And it came to be after these events that Elohim tried Abraham And he says, Abraham. And he said, Hineni, here I am. And he said, take your son now, your only son, Yitzhak, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as an ascending offering or a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I command you. Now we have a little phrase in here. Did you catch it? Take your son, your only son. Your only son. But was Yitzhak the only son? No. He had Ishmael as his first son. But Yahweh didn't see it that way. Maybe Yahweh didn't know he had Yitzhak, huh? I doubt it. I think Yahweh knew. But Yahweh did not view Ishmael as a legitimate son or as a legitimate heir. There's a case for plural marriage, isn't there? A case for polygamy. Yahweh did not view Ishmael as a legitimate son or a legitimate heir. He only recognized Yitzhak. Have we ever considered this when we thought of polygamy? Let's consider David. David had 3 wives before Bathsheba. He had Michal, who was the daughter of King Saul. And then Michal was taken away from her. Later he went and got her back. And then he had Abigail, who was the wife of Nabal. And he had Ahinoam. She was a Yisraelitess. So he had 3 wives. And then he got Bathsheba. And he had nothing but trouble. You know, men want 2 or 3 wives. You better consider, if you're going to have 2 or 3 wives, you're going to have 2 or 3 mothers-in-law. How many men want more than one mother-in-law? Actually, my mother-in-law, Joanne's mother, was a very righteous and holy woman. We didn't always get along. She didn't always approve of everything that I said or did. But at the end, I want to tell you something. I got to share this with you. At the end of her life, we were in a nursing home up in Wisconsin visiting her. She called me over and to her bedside, and she says, you know, we've had our differences, but I want to tell you something. You're a good son-in-law, and you're better to me than some of my own children. And of course, we had the twins, Ethan and Ariel, and they were just little tykes. And she said, I want to tell you that I love you. And that meant everything in the world to me. So I'm not trying to make fun of mothers-in-law, but David had trouble. His own son Absalom did some horrible things and turned against him and rebelled against him. He had rebellion in his house from one of his own sons. And then we have the example of Shlomo, or King Solomon, the wisest man in the whole world. And he was told at the very beginning, do not multiply wives and horses to yourself. And if you multiply wives, they're going to turn your heart away. And that's exactly what happened. He married the daughter of this king and the daughter of that king and the daughter of another king, and he built temples for them. Oh, you worship this god, you worship that god, you worship this idol. Some of them were filthy, abominable idols. And he built houses of worship to appease his wives. And he fell away from the worship of Yahweh. I don't know what his judgment's going to be. I don't know what he did. It's none of my business. Yahweh will take care of it. I'm not going to judge Solomon. We have no right to do that. But he did sin in multiplying wives to himself. Oh, do you want the ideal marriage? Go back to Yitzhak and Rivka. So polygamy is illegal today. So why do it anyhow, even if it was legal? You want the bottom line on polygamy? Well, we have the example of Esau too, don't we? In Genesis 26. Esau's wives were a grief of mind to both Yitzhak and Rivka. And Rivka says, I despair of my life because of these women. And so Esau had a solution to the problem. He went out and got another pagan wife to marry and compounded the situation. So if we turn over to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, and we'll read verse 8. Because he who sows to his own flesh shall reap corruption from the flesh, but he who sows to the Spirit shall reap everlasting life from the Spirit. So here again, you're going to get my opinion. I think that these people who are attracted to polygamy are sowing to the flesh and not to the Spirit. They're thinking themselves. So men, if you got a problem in this area, my only advice is sow to the Spirit, and if you need to, cut back on the Viagra or something, you know, and whatever you need to do. But no, I'm serious. Let's read about the ideal woman in Proverbs chapter 31. Because this is something, it's called the Eshathayil, and normally I read this to Joanne as we open the Shabbat every Friday night. Who does find a capable wife? For she is worth far more than rubies. Your wife should be to you more valuable than any earthly treasure. She shall do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She shall seek wool and flax and work with her hands. She shall be as the ships of Tarshish. She brings in her food from afar. What does that mean? It means she shops around for bargains. That's what it means. She gets the best deal she can for the money she has. She rises also while it is still night and provides food for her household and what is lawful for her girls. What if she don't have any girls? Well, she does in a sense. Their household appliances can be her girls. She uses them wisely. Okay? She takes advantage of the modern conveniences of life. Okay, she shall consider a field and buy it, and from her profit she shall plant a vineyard. And there's a lot of metaphorical meaning to this word vineyard. She shall gird herself with strength and strengthen her arms. You see, the ideal woman is a perfect woman. And again, we have to go back to the definition of perfect. We were taught that perfect means to have integrity. And to have integrity means to be honest, to live your life with a purpose. And what is our purpose? To be in the kingdom of Yahweh, to serve Almighty Yahweh, and to help your husbands be there with you. That's the ideal woman. And to help your children be in that kingdom. That's the ideal mother. And she's capable because she has the faith and the determination to serve Yahweh, and it's not always easy to do. And that's why we have Verse 11, the heart of her husband shall trust her, and he has no lack of gain. So you want your husband to trust you? Be the ideal woman. And her husband trusts her because she respects him. That's what we read about, what we read about when we delved into subjection. Now, Proverbs 31 shows that the woman takes the initiative. Now, brothers and sisters, we said this message was meant for everyone. Regardless of our state, whether we're married, divorced, widowed, widower, single, unmarried, whatever, we are to live the Torah. Amen. Let's turn over to Titus, the little book of Titus. Bear with me while I turn over there. All right, 2 Timothy here. Well, we just passed it up. Sorry about that. We'll read in the book of Titus, chapter 2. Verses 1 through 8. And this applies to everybody regardless of your marital state. But you speak what is fitting for sound teaching. The older men are to be sober, serious, sensible, sound in belief, in love, and in endurance. And the older women likewise are to be set apart in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine. You can have a little wine, but not much. Teachers of what is good, in order for them to train the young women to love their husbands and to love their children. So many people today do not love their children. It was brought out on the television that one of the problems that's prevalent in the black community today is the high incidence of illegal births. Children coming into the world who do not know who their fathers are. Amen. And that's not a racial thing. I'm not trying to be a racist by bringing that out. But some minorities have lost sight of the ideal marriage. Why? Because they're without Torah. Amen. They're not taught Torah. And people in all races and ethnic origins are guilty of this. People today have the idea, oh, hey, there's a good-looking woman. I think I'll take her and we'll share the same toothbrush and the same toaster. We'll try it out and see if it works. And then if it doesn't work, why, I'll go get someone else. What did we say was the bond between Yitzhak and Rivka? Commitment. There's no commitment in that. You don't try someone out. You have to marry someone with whom you can have a commitment. Amen. And then you have to be faithful to that commitment. Amen. Now, sometimes things happen when a marriage has to dissolve, and Rabbi Steve will be covering that. But likewise, urge the young men to be sensible. So many young men today are not sensible. They think of crazy things. I saw a cartoon on Facebook where it says, careful, children at play, and it showed swings and sliding boards and seesaws, and all the little children were sitting on benches with cell phones or little games in their hand, instead of exercising and playing and jumping around. And then I put a thing on my Facebook page. It says, instead of giving them an Xbox, give them a tackle box. You know, I don't know if any of you saw that. But give them a tackle box. You know, For entertainment, when I was a kid, we used to go out into the woods and just walk around. And I'd walk around in the summer, in the winter, in the freezing cold. I loved it. But I think very few kids today know and understand that experience. We have to give it to them. We have to teach the younger men to be sensible. Show yourself to them an example of good works in all manners. In teaching, show uncorruptness and seriousness. So it's our responsibility as part of a marriage to teach our children the things that they need to learn and that they need to do. Soundness of speech beyond reproach, in order that the opponent is put to shame, having no evil word to say about you. Soundness of speech. How many watched the part of the riots going on in Baltimore this past week? They had the bleep, bleep, bleep almost every other word. There was no soundness of speech. You go to Facebook, and sometimes I'm ashamed, deeply ashamed of the posts that come on my page, sometimes from my own family members. The words that they use, they're far from sound speech. So Titus 2, verses 1 through 8. Revelation chapter 19. We're about ready to wrap up here. Let's go to Revelation chapter 19. And we're going to read verses 7 and 9. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him praise, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife prepared herself. And verse 9, and he said to me, write, blessed are those who have been called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the two words of Elohim. Brothers and sisters, I don't care what your marriage state is. If you're married or unmarried for any reason, you're going to be the guest of honor. We're all going to be the guest of honor if we're faithful at a marriage. And strange as it may seem, we're going to be the bride. Even the men are going to be the bride of the Messiah. There are two women represented in Scripture. One is Israel, and one is the harlot. And Israel is the woman who's pure and made pure and spotless through the blood of the Messiah. And she'll be dressed in white linen. And the other is the great harlot. And we know what she's like. So we only have two choices. So what kind of marriage do we want to have? In our final scripture, Revelation 21, verse 2, and I, Yochanan, saw the set-apart city, renewed Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So again, especially if you're not married and you're looking to be married, choose a marriage partner wisely. If you're having trouble in your marriage and you can't resolve it, come to the leadership. And the leadership will counsel you. And if you are married, work at your marriage. It takes work. And as we said, the men have the obligation, if there's anything in the marriage that isn't quite right, the first resort, the first thing we must do is pray. And so, Almighty Yahweh, bless us all. And thank you for listening to me. Amen. Avinu Malkeinu, we come to you again. And we thank you for the words that have been presented here. And we ask you to, that we can take these words and meditate on them throughout the coming week and throughout the coming month and throughout our lives. In Yeshua's name, amen.